Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to another session of Islamicate Authors. This is a regular weekly session that I have where I will be in dialogue with authors, scholars, and in some cases activists to discuss just a whole host of issues that might be of interest to, I hope, a rather broad range of listeners and viewers. And I also would like to highlight that you have the opportunity to put questions to the author in question for a given week, and that will come up in the comments, and inshallah hopefully we'll reserve 15 minutes to half an hour towards the latter half of this for addressing some of those questions. I'm really delighted to bring someone I have read over many years and find a very scintillating writer and a fascinating thinker, Prof Salman Sayyid of Leeds University, whose book in particular, Recalling the Caliphate, I was looking forward to discuss with him. But he's also the author of an important book before this, which I can see is right behind you, Prof Sayyid, A Fundamental Fear. And I actually have had opportunities to have conversations with Prof Sayyid over the years, and we've had these interesting moments where I, as someone who is coming from a kind of ulum shar'iyya background, is interacting with a scholar who is very deeply grounded within the Western philosophical tradition, but in a way that is fundamentally questioning the Eurocentrism of that tradition. I hope I'm characterizing you fairly. And so it really gives me great pleasure to be able to perhaps engage in something of a dialogue on some of these themes. And without further ado, I wanted to ask if you wanted to start off something, or if you'd like me to go ahead and ask one of those questions that I have lined up for you, inshallah.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you so much. And I don't know whether it's fairly, but I think it's at least interesting characterization, and perhaps that's sometimes more important for these kind of conversations, to be interesting rather than to be fair. But
Sure.
yes, I think that's one way of putting it. So I'm more than happy for you to start off and pursue this conversation.
Fantastic. So one of the points that we were talking about just before we came on air was about the way in which, in some respects, your writing sits adjacent to the traditional Islamic discourses of the ulama. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight was my colleague and friend Muhammad Bushra at Georgetown finishing off his PhD, and I'm really looking forward to reading his sort of reflections, is the translator of your work into Arabic. And he's someone who thinks that with someone with foots in both worlds of Arabic texts and the Islamic studies tradition, so to speak, and the Western philosophical tradition, particularly drawing on sort of postmodernism. And he thinks that there are great possibilities of synergy between those two traditions that are only beginning to be explored potentially at this point. And so I wanted to begin by perhaps asking somewhat left of field question for someone who's not part of that tradition, what sort of synergies you think might arise and should potentially be explored, and what sort of questions that people who are more textualists like myself should really be reflecting on in our postmodern context.
I think the way I would frame it is this. What is common to both enterprises, I suppose at one level, must be the rearticulation of the islamicate. And one of the key elements that drives my work or my interests is the recognition that Islamic studies, as it's become, as it exists in the universities, and is not what was taught in pre-colonial times or was taught by autonomous Islamicate tradition. Now, when you say that, obviously many Orientalists say, no, this is nonsense. And also many Muslim scholars would say, no, this is wrong, because we can trace our lineages. We have been doing the same pedagogic method since whatever. But I think the point that I'm making is perhaps broader than that. I'm not disputing the pedagogic effort. I'm not disputing the way that the curriculum develops, etc. But I'm disputing this thing. I cannot imagine Islamic studies is something that an autonomous political Muslim tradition actually taught. So when you look at the kind of revered figures of the past, they're not doing Islamic studies. For example, they're not doing Islamic philosophy. They're doing philosophy. So the marker, the signifier of the mark of the Islamic is a curious one. And it is the tracing of that mark that I think both, I would say sort of where I would describe my work as sort of critical Muslim studies. One way of thinking about critical Muslim studies is really as a project to question and interrogate this marked, to making Islam marked by Islamic. And that then opens up a whole vista in many, many different areas. As you well know, most Muslims will say to you categorically something like, Islam is a way of life. But when they are actually asked to draw out this way of life, imagine this way of life, it's almost close to a sort of monasticism, Christian monasticism. But that is not, if you believe Islam is a way of life, then you don't need to impoverish that way of life and reduce it to the Christian monasticism to open it up. And once you think about Islam as unmarked rather than marked by the Islamic, then I think the possibilities of imagining a future rather than simply trying to recover the past become closer at hand.
I wonder if I can sort of ask you, when you say Islam is being marked, is this in some sense related to your critique of Eurocentric readings of Islam as particularism? Or is it something slightly different?
It's partly related to that, but I think the point that I was referring to is simply something from insight from lexical lexemes. So if you take the term, for example, lion and lioness, lioness is marked because by adding the suffix, you make lioness particular. So lion can stand for both the male of the species, but also the species in general. Yeah. So in a sense, the marking is a more restrictive use. So you're right. It is about the particularization. So, for example, to particularize Islam as religion, in a way, if you look at, the way that I think Muslim understandings of Islam would be that it is the way. It is not, doesn't have this kind of categorization. And we often forget in the haste that we use, for example, to, nowadays, if you ask, and you go to these Islamic bookshops, if you ask any Muslim, they will translate deen into religion.
Right.
But what's interesting, the work that's been done, looking at the early translations of the Quran before the category of religion circulated, in which Islam is translated, deen is translated into law or sacred law. Yeah. And I would say to you that, there's an argument to be made that among, for example, the use of data, the way, the law, all of these terms are used by non-Christians to describe, or non-post or non-Western Christians to describe what they do.
Right. Non-post-Reformation Christians.
Yeah, exactly. Or post-Enlightenment, this kind of thing. It's only, and the kind of work that the invention of world religions.
Right.
And then Islam becomes a world religion. But if you're a Muslim, it's not a religion. And not because all religions will be defective, because the model of the template is a post-Enlightenment or Enlightenment reading of Western Christianity. Which then problematizes all other categories. So when I talk about the marked by the Islamic, I would say that one of the problems is this, that the Islamic marking and the politics around that have been transformed in relation to, for example, the European colonial enterprise and the kind of what let's call, perhaps problematically, what I would say the autonomous Islamicate tradition. In which case Muslims, when they did things, they thought of them, they were doing Muslim things, or they were in dialogue with Muslimness when they were doing it. They
Right.
were not they were not enacting out the Islamic for the benefit of others. They were trying to
Interesting.
work out the Muslimness in relation to themselves and the community they were putting together.
Are you suggesting that the nominative or the nominal, in a sense, the noun needs to be recognized as a product, in a sense, of Orientalism, in a way that the subject or the active participle needn't be understood, and so people are
Yeah,
interesting. Okay,
yeah.
I
I think, so, I mean, the other way to put it is this, that, like I said to you, Orientalism creates, one of Orientalism creation is Islamic studies.
right,
And what
right,
Islamic studies does is have a certain fascination for certain aspects. It trains people, and now one of the claims of Islamic studies, well, we've got many Muslim scholars, but the thing is that they're socialized into that, and there's a huge uh, literature of talking about different kind of experiences
right,
of that uncertain relationship. An example that comes to mind many years ago, um, I met a sister in Islam who she was doing a PhD in this country
right.
on Muslim women, and she had given the title to her PhD, "The Daughters of Allah." And I was very curious about why she had done this, and I said, "Well, did any of your respondents refer to themselves as daughters of Allah?" She said, "No." And I said, "Well, do you think so? Where does this come from? How does this term?" And
Sure.
she said her supervisor had suggested that title and she felt uncomfortable with it, but didn't feel that she could contest it.
Right.
Now, the world is a big place, and I'm not making any kind of comprehensive or argumentative statement, but to me, and my understanding of the Islamicate, the idea of Muslims calling themselves sons and daughters of Allah seems peculiar.
That's a very
Uh,
mild way of
can I
putting
put
it.
it like that? Would that be a fair assessment? I don't know. Would you,
It,
would you share that peculiarity?
I would say that's a very generous assessment of that sort of a label. Um, because, of course, that phrase emerges within the Quran is roundly condemned. It's a practice of the sort of Arab
Exactly.
polytheists, right?
Yeah.
Of
But also, it is
designating the
not a
angels.
phrase that it is not a phrase that you would find any self-respect. And this is one of the markers of, representations of Orientalism, that the phrase emerges
Right.
on these, either you see these in sort of these Hollywood action-packed movies where the terrorists will put on this name or something like that. But, like you said, it is not something that one would expect to encounter in a Muslim context, whether it's in Indonesia or in Trinidad or Tobago
Right.
or
Right.
wherever. It's just difficult to imagine that.
Right.
Now, I am not, making a wider claim that, but it just seemed to me that's a really, really odd
And,
phrasing.
and what I'd suggest, I mean, perhaps I can present a
Sure.
counterpoint to your sort of conception of the Islamic as being sort of should be subsumed under the Muslim, so to speak, reading that the Islamic is in a sense a product of the Orientalist. I think I can entirely understand where that critique originates, and I am very sympathetic to it. The way in which, in a sense, by labeling something as Islamic, you're subsuming it within the particular, you're subsuming it within the conception of religion that's coming out of the Eurocentric sort of ideas that emerged post Enlightenment, and Kant, and what is the function of religion, as it were, after the Enlightenment. Now, and those have been very well critiqued now in the religious studies literature, and I think by one of your students as well, um, uh, Hizar Khan. Forgive
His
me.
Amir.
Hizar
His
Mir.
Amir.
He's a
Yeah,
friend. I know
he
him
did
as
very
Hizar.
well. Yeah, yeah.
But at the same time, there is an indigenous tradition of the Islamic, which comes out of textual canons that is antecedent, it predates these Western traditions. And there's an interesting conversation to be had about to what extent have those traditions been contaminated, in a sense, by this universal hegemonic project of Western conceptualizations of various categories, including, I think, crucially for our purposes, religion. But I think, and to a certain extent, inspired by your ideas, and I'm although I don't think I specifically reference your work.
Why not, Sam?
I should have. I mean, I should have been a bit more attentive, obviously. But
Obviously.
but no, I mean, I'm hopefully publishing something within sort of Islamic studies in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society on Maududi's conception of sovereignty.
Right.
And in a sense, what I'm saying is that in opposition to a lot of people who are saying, oh, look, Maududi is kind of doing this merging of religion and politics in this really problematic way, is that the only way you could ever think that is if you were myopically presentist and your understanding of what constituted religion and politics were defined by the Enlightenment.
Well, this is one of the things that I argue in Fundamental Fear, because one of the things that Fundamental Fear does is a critique of the idea of Islamic fundamentalism. And one of the claims often made about fundamentalism in general, but also specifically about Islamic fundamentalism, as it was called then, is that it confuses politics with religion or vice versa.
Right.
But that confusion is only possible if you actually think that these two are distinct domains. Right. So you already have to assume the distinction of the two. Right. And one of the ways, and this is where I think Kalanjar's, I find his phrasing very, very seductive and powerful, that in fact it's the oddity of Christianity of a particular kind, which says that politics and religion are separate at some point in time. Right. It doesn't make any sense for many people, including not just Muslims, but I would say, for example, Jewish people, Hindu texts, Zoroastrian. It doesn't.
No pre-modern tradition.
No. But all religions, in a sense, hail to sort of pre-modern. Well, I say all, probably not Sikhism or the Mormons, but even then, that idea of distinguishing those two ways of life are complicated in a way by that. So yes, I totally agree.
So can I sort of come to another question which is adjacent to this about the Islamic, which is that, yes, the Orientalist tradition, in a sense, the problem is this kind of essentialization of the category of Islam. And in a sense, speaking with authority and telling Muslims what they can and cannot be or do, etc. But
I don't have anything about people with speaking with authority. I think this is a false kind of argument here that people often say. Right. So there are groups of people who, I remember this phrase, who would say something like to you or me or to others or to each other, I am a Muslim in my own way.
Okay.
And my kind of thing is not to be dogmatic about it, but I think that's just, that's a nonsense. That's an oxymoron. Right. Because
this is your first chapter, I think, isn't it? You talk about this in the first chapter of the book.
You can't be a Muslim in your own way.
Right.
For the same reason, you can't speak English in your own way.
Right.
You can't speak Bengali in your own way. You can't speak, you can't do anything in your own way, because all of these are social engagements and social actions. And they have to correspond or learn what that community understands.
Right.
So, for example, even eating is not in your own way. There are manners and there are sort of restrictions on what you mix or you don't mix.
Right.
So the idea of saying, well, you can eat in your own way, well, where would be the locus of that own way? Because we're always socialized into eating. So, for example, in certain cuisines, certain things are mixed and other things are not.
Right.
And I'm not just talking about religiously, but aesthetically. So, for example, if you look at food which mixes sweet and sour, and food which keeps those separate.
Right. Or,
the kind of sequencing of particular kinds of foods, or the use of how you use proteins, carbohydrates in different kind of displays. So to say that you do something in your own way seems to be a kind of a neoliberal illusion of Nietzschean Übermensch, which they don't really understand or know of. So, I mean, this is the whole problem. So that's why I would say to you, for my issue, isn't the question of authority.
Right.
The only thing I would say to you is that the authority of the islamicate is not configured in the way of the authority of the Christian, because and even among the Jafri tradition, etc., where they have a more structured,
Right.
let's say, ultimately you're not talking about priesthoods, you're talking
Right.
about scholarship. And
Right. Right.
scholarship allows for the fact that you ultimately there is an element of you follow a particular scholar
Right.
or you agree with their conclusions, and another scholar comes along and you may agree or disagree with their conclusions. There's no sacerdotal impulse to that.
Hmm.
And in fact, that's been the case that people can move, change their minds, have different. If you don't like a particular ruling or a particular fatwa, you get another one, or you
Right.
find and
Right.
that's the kind of engagement, the social engagement. So the question isn't about authority,
Right.
because
Right.
I think all of us would concede, and all of us who are in the academic business. I mean, the question is that, of course, we have authority. I
Right.
mean, and I know otherwise you end up in this undifferentiated thing where a student says something like, um, I haven't read Judith Butler, but my opinion is that she is wrong based
Hmm.
on my opinion. And then I
Hmm.
think, well, why is that invaluable to anyone? So, in a
Right.
sense, is that,
Right.
there is a question about scholarship, there's a question about reading, there's a question about formulating opinions or not formulating opinions, but formulating understandings,
Right.
which is slightly
So,
different.
so, I mean, in a sense, where I was going with that question is interesting. Your response to the first part of it, in some respects, puts me in. I mean, wants me to get greater clarity on exactly what type of essentialism you are problematizing, right? So, it's not that you have a problem with a scholar making a claim about what Islam is, but in your view, that doesn't constitute meaning a cleric, for example. You gave the example of a marja or something like this. You were saying that the problem isn't that people make claims based on authority, but in a sense, if I recall correctly, you have two definitions of essentialism in your book, where you say one type is basically problematizing Europe, and the other type is something which we all have to accept. Oh, sorry.
Well,
Yeah.
so there's two things that I say.
Sorry.
There's
Sorry.
one thing which is
Mm-hmm.
anti-essentialism,
Mm-hmm.
which is a critique of essentialism, and the other one is
Okay.
anti-universalism. And what
Okay.
I've said is that what people are willing to do is accept anti-essentialism, but not the critique of anti-essentialism as a critique of essentialism, but not
Right.
anti-universalism.
Can I
So,
ask specifically about
sure,
essentialism, just to get
sure.
clarity on what do you mean by essentialism? And Muslims sometimes. I had this conversation with you a while back where I was like
Mm.
saying, "Wait, don't we believe that there's something essential to Islam?" And that's a misunderstanding, I think, of the way in which essentialism, has a reference, so to speak. But I'd appreciate your clarifying.
Yeah, sure. I think
Yeah.
that the best way I would put it now is that essentialism is a denial of historicity.
Okay.
So, of course, Muslims believe in things
Right.
which are people may call them essential or critical or
Right. Right. Right.
significant, etc.
Right.
But I hope that Muslims would not deny the historicity of Islam in the sense of, for example, the founding mission of the
Right.
Prophet, peace be
To,
upon him,
right.
himself,
Right.
right? So
Yeah.
there is a historicity already gained in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is not. So the essentialism would be a argument that Islam has no history.
Right.
It would be a
Right.
recognition that none of its categories or disputes or its have any, they cannot happen. Or there are,
Right.
so I think essentialism for me is a denial of historicity, and that's what essentialism is. So it simply says that something is coherent across time as the same as it always will be. Now,
Right.
we make certain claims that the Islam of the Prophet's time is the same as Islam of our time.
Right.
And but the way that we talk about the sameness, I think we need to be clear about it.
Interesting.
Clearly, there is. We recognize the difference in the social context. We recognize the difference that's moved in there. So what we're trying to find out, it seems to me, is that which is allows for the condition of Islam to be circulating, etc., in a way that we would not
Can
contest
I
or.
can I
Sorry, go on.
suggest? Forgive me. Can
No.
I suggest that, in a sense, what you're saying about anti-essentialism, it's demonstrated by your first chapter about what it means to even be a Muslim. The fact that, it doesn't make a great deal of sense to sort of, I think the example you gave was drink alcohol and think that eating pork is fine, and say that there's nothing in any way sort of contradictory between that and my being a firmly sort of like a Muslim in good standing, shall we say, something along those lines. So there, in a sense, that would deal with my anxiety. That are you saying, wait, Islam doesn't have an essence, so you can kind of make it up as you go along? And
No, but the thing is,
basically
that
saying, no, you
Islam
can't.
no. I'm saying Islam doesn't have an essence because nothing has an essence except God, and that's another matter. But
Right.
what I would say to you is this: because Islam doesn't have an essence, that is why you cannot make it up. That is why it needs to be, it needs the interpretation, it needs a text, it needs scholarship, it needs constant engagement, but ultimately it needs faith and belief. Because in a way, what you're constantly having to do is make up for the fact that we are mortals, we are finite, and we are not essential. So in the example that I talk about is this: we know historically at different points, Muslim customs around the prohibition of alcohol have varied, right? And there is dispute about, some would say, well, as long as you not go to your prayers drunk, it's okay, and if it's wine from the date, it doesn't. There are all kinds
Right.
of permutations, and we know historically some Muslims have engaged in alcohol and at the same time been pious. Now, this, for example, Shabir Ahmed's book recently is made into a big thing, is like a big
Right.
kind of scandalous moment, but it's actually not that scandalous in a sense, because constantly, if I go now to most parts of the Muslim world, I would be asked to comport myself in a particular way, or expected to comport myself in a particular way. Because right now, the Muslim community, the Ummah, has an understanding of what it means to perform being Muslim.
Right.
Which is not the same as it may have had 200 years ago or 100 years ago.
Sure.
But it does now. And it would be churlish of me to pretend that it doesn't.
Right.
And for me to be engaged in that performance and to be part of that performance, I have to engage with that. So this is why there is no kind of there is no particular. Yeah, well, there's no trans-historical element to this. What I want to say about this is that there's a sense in which Muslimness is constantly being reconfigured by the Ummah. But because the Ummah is large and it's great, that reconfiguration has its own kind of very slow pace to it. Because to be recognized as a Muslim, so for example, both you and I started by saying Bismillah.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Now, if I went to Timbuktu or if I went to Dakar and I said Bismillah, it would be understood.
Right.
The meaning would have some kind of significance, and they would know, people would there know how to respond. We're talking about societies which are 90% Muslim.
Right.
At what point is it right to say or not? And if I said, well, actually, I'm not going to do it this way, I'm going to do it something else, at the most it will do is simply not be, we wouldn't register it as such. We wouldn't register this is not how you perform Muslimness.
Okay. But I mean, let me give a slight counterpoint to that, which is that in essence, what you're saying here is that Muslims have the prerogative to make decisions as a collective about what it means to be sort of Muslim.
No, you're making it when you make it say about decision, you make it too kind of agentic.
Okay.
That there's somebody there. I don't think we make a decision. So, for example, most Muslims, how do we learn to be Muslims? We normally do it through our families and our communities, and then we broaden that prospect, right?
Sure.
And at the point when you're socialized into it, you're not making a decision. This is the nonsense that some of the new kind of people at Dawkins say somehow that people have to make a decision. You make no decision.
Right.
In fact, we rarely make a decision about any sort of. We are thrown. This is the whole Heideggerian point. We're thrown into a world, a social world as well. We don't make a decision. You don't make a decision about your parents. You don't make a decision about your family. You're thrown into that,
Sure.
and you work through that.
Right.
So what I would say to you is this: that it's not a decision in a sense that here is one locus that 1.6 or 2 billion Muslims get together and vote on what is Islam. That's not how it
Right.
happens.
Right.
It could never happen like that. But
It's more
there
organic,
is
you're saying.
it's a more organic, it's a process of
Mhm.
construction of hegemony or common sense. To give you
Right.
another more contemporary example,
Sure.
if you go to any part of the Islamosphere or any part of the Ummah, 9 times out of 10, you are more likely to hear a story which of the Palestinians which rejects Zionism.
Right.
If you go to most parts of the United States, you're more likely to hear a story which of the Palestinians, which basically is an account which is Zionist inspired.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
Now,
Yeah.
one of the anger and the bewilderment many people have is why should people in Indonesia care or think, or in Bosnia think about Palestine, etc.
Right.
And they try then to find this conspiratorially kind of some sort of, there's a thing about money and things like that.
Sure.
But the reason is this, that what has happened in the 70 years, this has become part of the common sense. And even sort of Christian Palestinians or secular Palestinians recognize that without the Muslim commitment, the Palestinian cause would be far, far weaker.
Right.
So what you have now is one of the ways that you can have a conversation. And again, I make no excuses for the, how can I say, the gymnastics of governments such as of Morocco or the UAE or these
Right.
others
Right.
establishing various kinds of relationships, etc., and all
Right.
of that. That's a separate matter.
Yeah.
But at the level of a conversation, nor do I make a ground for some of the people in some of the Afghans who were supportive of the occupation, gaining by the occupation, now suggesting that Afghanistan needs to make an alliance with Israel because they both have a common enemy, which is Islam or radical Islam or whatever it may be. Again,
Right.
I accept that these views exist, but
Right.
I would say to you, Nassama, that these are such minuscule views.
Yeah. Yeah.
They are on the level of flat Earth society in a sense, really.
Right.
But as a
And
general calculation, yes, sorry.
and they're only sustainable in the because of the backing of
Yeah, whatever. But
problematic.
but the common sense remains. So there is a Muslim common sense of how to be a Muslim, which has changed over time
Right.
and continues to change. 50, 30 years ago, how you perform being a Muslim. Most
Yeah.
university students, male Muslim students, wouldn't have beards.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I would say,
It-
I wouldn't.
yeah.
Most do now.
Right, right. And I mean, in a place like Egypt in the 1950s, most women didn't wear hijab. Most do now.
Yeah.
So,
Or this is something that you could argue, it's true in most parts of the Muslim world. The hijab
right, right,
has
right,
been redonned in a way, or in
right.
France, or in places like that. So that's a different kind. Now, what I don't think is right to say is
Sure.
either the beard or the hijab is what determines it, but it's to recognize that now we've reached a point where
Right.
these have become certain kinds of markers
Right.
of Muslimness, which they did not exist. That's what I mean. There's no particular essence to it,
Yeah.
but it becomes a way that people comport themselves and put themselves in that relationship,
So,
or say they want to be part of that, or they don't want to be part of that.
so I mean, what you've said reminds me of something one of my teachers during my undergraduate years, Yahya Michaud, said about the hijab at the time when he was teaching as well. He was saying, in a sense, there was a kind of ijma of the Egyptians in the 1950s that women didn't have to wear hijab, and today there has to be there's an ijma kind of in the contrary direction,
Yeah.
or virtual sort of. It's not ijma in any sort of
No, but I think
juristic sense.
yeah, no, I agree with you, but I think it's
Yeah.
a really good. One of the things I try to do in the work is actually to expand that concept of ijma away from the monopoly of the ulama. Not because I think
Right.
anyone can make it, but ultimately the ulama is also part of the ummah.
Right.
So in a sense, it is what the ummah determines
Right.
through its understanding, practically, productively, what it is, and that is how, and that exists prior to the formation of alims, the formation of them, because you already accept all of these things.
Right. Right. I mean, it's interesting. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, sorry, go on.
So, I mean, ijma is a contested concept, as you will know, even within the Islamic juristic tradition. And in a sense, like if you're very minimalist about it, the Quran and the Sunnah are the only two categories that remain uncontested, right? Ijma, qiyas, and things like that are these additional components which people have disputed. And I guess with sort of some minor exceptions, such as the ijma of the earliest community on certain questions like whether you can engage in bigamy with a woman and her maternal aunt or something like that, because those sorts of things are actually not in the Quran. Then I think they may well be in the hadith, but in a sense it's singular hadith, and then you have the ijma setting that as a universal norm. And in a sense, what I wanted to sort of point out is present as a potential counterpoint is how what you've presented about Muslims drinking or eating pork, etc. And as you say, Shahab Ahmed has written about this. A couple of your colleagues have written about this within the Hanafi tradition as well. Is that there are internal discourses within the Islamic tradition going back hundreds of years, which also negotiate these questions from a theological or a juristic perspective. And I wonder, in your view, what the place of those are, because they would have quite a different take, very often resulting in the same sort of effect in society. So they would say, okay, well, someone can drink alcohol, but that doesn't take them outside of being Muslim. They're just sort of, quote unquote, a bad Muslim, to use a modern sort of phrase. Whereas they would insist, the theologians would insist in I think both the Sunni and the Twelver traditions, and certainly in the Zaydi traditions, that if they considered drinking alcohol to be licit, not drinking alcohol, drinking khamr, which is sort of, I guess, somewhat different, according to some scholars, then that would be a rejection of a verse in the Quran. If they were made aware of it and they continued to persist in disbelieving its prohibited nature, that would take them outside of the fold of Islam. Whereas if they continue to drink, recognizing I'm a sinful person, I can't control my sort of impulses, then they're a Muslim, right? And I wonder, like, how would you place your own reading of this vis-a-vis that sort of tradition?
I don't think I would find it any problematic what you've said,
Right.
because it seems to me there's two issues here. One is whether you purposefully, and for whatever reason, and say that you are no longer a Muslim.
Right.
That's it. The other one is that you say that you are a Muslim, but you recognize, and with all humility, that being a Muslim is an unfinished project.
Right.
Now, most Muslims I meet or know, at least in their own humility, would want to say that I am trying to be a Muslim, might be a better word than say we're a finished article. Now, there are moments of vanity where you say, actually, I'm much better than that other so-and-so, and I don't do this and things. And again, that comes back to a communal standard of what is considered to be acceptable behavior. So, we know that there are many, many Muslims who are engaged in activities that we would consider to be certainly illegal, certainly unethical, certainly immoral. We can go through all of that.
Right.
And they would also call themselves Muslims and practice, they do their prayers, etc., etc.
Right.
What do we do with them? What we don't do, or I don't think we should do, is cast them outside, because A, it's not our job to do so. That's the first thing. And B, there's a certain lack of humility in that. because it seems to me that if you accept, and this is one of the things, if you look at the sort of classical scholarship, and you know this, Osama, how often did all the classical scholars finish their books with something like this, that, this is my opinion or my understanding, I do
And
not
God
say it's
knows
the
best.
truth.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and God
God
knows
knows
best.
best.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that phrase, and God knows best, seems to me is a recognition of anti-essentialism totally.
Fascinating. Absolutely. That's fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating to me because, in a sense, what you're articulating is very much, found within the textual canons within which I'm socialized. One thinks of the hadith in Sahih Muslim, seen as canonical, that, a man comes to another man and exhorts him to do something good. And then after a while, he tires of it and he says, Wallahi, God will never forgive you, right? And then God tells him on the Day of Judgment, who gave you that authority, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so yeah, I mean, this humility is, of course, part and parcel of the Islamic tradition in a very big way. I wanted to sort of think about the concept, a concept which plays a big role in this book in particular, and it's in the subtitle, which is Decoloniality. It's, I think, your professorial title as well, right? Professor of Decolonial Studies. And do you mind if I ask you just to sort of articulate for viewers in a handful of sentences what you would say decoloniality is really about?
Okay. In one way, decolonial thought, I can tell you the kind of brief history of it, emerges with mainly Latinx thinkers. You can locate it at a conference to start talking about the impact, the 500-year impact of the colonization of the Americas on the world. I think that's the sort of one way to look at it, right? And there's the idea of the coloniality of power, which says that, our epistemological categories that we have today have been founded upon this world-turning event.
Apologies, I've had an
No,
intruder,
it's okay.
but that's fine. Okay.
Sladikum, what's your name?
Unfortunately, you can't hear you because I've got earphones on.
Ah, of course you've got the earphones on
Apologies.
there. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, this is
That's
Majd.
fine.
Okay.
Majd. Sladikum. Take notes, Majd, please. And there will be questions afterwards. So part of the decoloniality is just this project, but so you could argue, and now what's happened since then, or decoloniality has expanded. And on the one hand, it's a recognition of the colonial inheritance that shapes modernity. So the critical thing about decoloniality is the way in which it puts into articulation modernity, coloniality. So the two sides. So basically, modernity is experienced throughout the planet is mainly through colonization and coloniality.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
The challenge I think it places for us is this: that it actually, the challenge we face with it is to do with the fact that what does coloniality and decolonization mean for the islamicate experience?
Right.
And that is one of the things that I'm trying to work out in this work and in inshallah, hopefully with the next book, which is should be coming out soon. But that really is because I think we can't simply. So on the one hand, there's an attempt to decolonize everything, but what does decoloniality mean for the Sinosphere? What does it mean for the? Because in a way, neither. So if you talk about 1492, so take something like 1492, Christopher Columbus conquers there. Okay, conquers. But for the Muslims, it's the end of Granada, right? So the argument is this: that what you have is a radical shift in global power, and you can make the linkages with the conquest of Granada leads to the conquest or enables the conquest of the what becomes the Americas.
Right.
However, the reason why the Reconquista then leads to the expulsion of Jews and Muslims is because there's a fear that a Muslim army from Africa will come and overthrow the Catholic king's or the monarch's order. and restore the Muslim and Jewish populations, restore Andalusia.
Right.
1492 is only about 40 years after 1453, when the Muslims basically take Constantinople.
That's actually,
It's only,
yeah, incredible.
it's only about 20 years in the future when Muslims are besieging Vienna.
Yeah.
So the idea that it marks the tilting of the horizon of the world
Yes.
is not that apparent for Muslim experiences.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
So what does it mean to now? Some people would argue what decoloniality means is that we need to recognize the Muslim empire and the Muslim, but this is completely to misunderstand the relationship between European colonial empires and imperialism, which is very, very distinct from previous articulations and the spatializations of power. Because one of the key things which I would say about European colonial enterprise is the invention of racism. And that is singular,
right,
and produces different kinds of logics. So you just cannot translate the Muslim into just another instance of, and Walter Mignolo, one of the decolonial thinkers, says that you can't just translate the wretched of the earth, the dispossessed of the earth, into all these other categories. Because Muslims maintain their agency, their ability to will themselves into the future for a very, very long time. Many of the rebellions that occur in the Americas among the enslaved are led by Muslims, are involved Muslims. Between 50 to 30% of those enslaved were Muslims.
right.
But this is a history that's lost. Now, there's a very interesting one of the main rebellions in Brazil. One of the rebels takes on, in Mali, he takes on the name Bilal,
right,
one of the leaders.
right.
And I pointed this out. I said, and I wrote to this Brazilian author. I said, do you know anything about why he did this? And he says it's of no historical significance. But it would seem to me odd that a Muslim working in the Muslim tradition who
right.
rebels, takes on the
Right.
name Bilal, does it
Right.
simply like the Wombles, just picking out from the
Right.
atlas a name of a city. It's not a.
Was this an African slave who was rebelling?
It was African enslaved
Right,
rebelling,
right,
and
right. The symbolism,
there.
right.
The symbolism is it's well, like I said, and there's work being done by people like Sylvia Diouf and others, and the whole kind of African American Muslim experience to recover some of these things that have these in a very very, very difficult circumstances, but in a way that in contrast that to the portrayal of the islamicate as being external to Africaneity rather than constitutive of Africaneity. And you see that, for example, most notably as an article in a recent article by Harold Bashir in Reorient mentions at the beginning of Black Panther, the scene with Black Panther, where there are obviously Muslim enslavers, but who are, rather than seeing that those Muslims were also involved in ending enslavement. And in fact, it was Muslim polities, African Muslim polities, if you want to put it like that, which prevented European slavery up till about the 17th or 18th century. So the picture of the idea of the islamicate as being external to the constitutive of Africaneity gets lost in some of these expansion of the unproblematic notion and expansion of decoloniality. And you can multiply many other examples there. So one point about decoloniality must be that you cannot simply read Western history or European history as a template for world history and its understanding of world history. So the uses of categories don't have a transhistorical element. They don't have a transhistorical meaning that you could say that you can trace these kinds of attitudes are the same as other kinds of attitudes. And if we had more time, we could multiply those examples. But
I'm conscious of your time because you have to leave, you said, by 7:15. And I just want to let viewers know that if you do want to ask any questions in the next few minutes, please feel free to ask. Safiya says hi, and Salman Yunus says, mashallah, I think he might have been commenting about my son walking in. Jazakumullah khairan for joining us. And I actually had quite a response online when I posted that I was going to be interviewing you, so got a larger than usual.
What kind of response did you have?
No, just I tweeted it, and
okay.
My tweet sort of was liked by a lot of people, as it were. That's how social media works, which is very kind of people. I wanted to switch gears slightly on the decoloniality and ask someone who I mentioned that I was going to be interviewing you was asking about how you would engage with someone like Hallaq or on a very different sort of spectrum, I suppose. Not too different. Someone like Abdul Hakim Murad. So these are very two figures who might be characterized as more traditionalist. They're also quite familiar with postmodern philosophy. They're a bit more textualist. Hallaq is interestingly not even a Muslim, right? And their discourse is arguably very anti-political in a certain way. Political in another sense, I think.
No.
And I just would, while I've got you, so to speak,
sure,
wanted to ask how you would, in a sense, articulate your vision as being different from theirs and perhaps better than theirs, not in a competitive sense.
I don't know. No. Well, the only encounter I had with, a recent encounter I had with Hallaq wasn't exactly a meeting of minds, so let's put it like that.
Okay.
And what I wouldn't say better, all I would say is this, that if you cannot tell, not you, I think all I can do is lay out my set of, I wouldn't say arguments, simply propositions, and allow others to see if they find them useful as reminders, they find them useful in a way of understanding things, and then see what comes out of it. As you know, and in my work, I try to demonstrate in this book, if you believe in the ethical, you must then also believe in the political. And it's really, really important that you kind of accept that. And I think and I think the difference would be around that particular issue. And I give you the example, and not just using the example from Iqbal and the epigraph that he gives, about what the difference between the prophetic and the mystic is, and the difference is really between the idea that the prophetic is really about transformation of society rather than simply closure with the divine. And there's a famous kind of quote there that Muhammad of Arabia ascended the highest heaven, and by God, if it had been me, I would never have returned, and by God, if it had been me, I would never have come back. And I think as a Muslim, you suddenly understand the kind of, there's a kind of a way that I find that very, very powerful, very, very evocative. And if we just reflects on that the prophet, the greatness of the prophet arises on the return. And who among the Muslims would want to return, or could, in that sense, in that situation? So, and that, it seems to me, but that's a very different notion of the political than I think perhaps others have. And I certainly think the idea of a depoliticization of the Islamicate and depoliticization of Islam is really, really pernicious and problematic.
Hallaq does offer very compelling critiques of modernity, of course. I think you'd see eye to eye with him on much of those ideas. But I don't think
I'm not particularly, maybe, but I'm not saying that my enemy isn't.
Right.
I don't have a critique of modernity. It's simply to recognize that modernity is completely embroiled with coloniality.
Right. Right.
So
Interesting.
that's sort of, what I think is really the case. I mean, I don't have a strong uh, fear about that. And it's certainly, but I would never call myself a modernist of any kind, in the sense that
Interesting.
I'm not committed to a modernist reading. I would say, if I had to say, that I'm basically, I'm doing kind of a history of things. I'm just doing a historicist. I mean, I understand, but I don't think that, I guess one of the ways I see Islam is a way of trying to write a history of a post-Western future. I mean, that's what, the thing, the subtitle of my, one of the main things of the new book is really try,
When
what
can
we're
we
looking.
look forward to that? And also, you mentioned you've got a second edition of Recalling the Caliphate coming
Well,
out. So
second edition of Recalling the Caliphate should be out this year, inshallah.
fantastic.
So it will have the Arabic preface to the Arabic edition in it, and so that will be the Islamism as philosophy has been much delayed by when life gets in the way of living, kind of thing.
Right.
But I'm hoping that I will be able to send it to the publishers soon, inshallah.
Inshallah, may Allah grant you tawfiq. Yes, I mean, I personally benefit a great deal from reading, whether it's Abdul Hakim Murad, Wal Halaq, or yourself, and I think these are, complementary and dialogical, and sometimes in very sort of interesting ways. Those disagreements can be also productive, and I
Of
appreciate the
course.
opportunities to read you all.
No, no,
I want,
absolutely.
yeah,
Sorry, I just want to make a point about this. I have
yeah,
no, I think you're absolutely right. And I also don't feel, to go back to the kind of scholarships, that all I can present is these propositions that have come there. I don't make any stronger case for them, and
right,
in the abstract. And so I'm perfectly happy for people to. Well, happy maybe putting it too generously. I'm perfectly
right,
understand that people will
right,
come to
right. Of
different kind
course.
of conclusions.
Of course, of course. I wanted to take a couple of questions which have come in.
Sure.
One coming from someone who joins the show fairly often. Black Viper is his screen name, and he asks, "Didn't racism exist in pre-colonial empires? It is often spoken of that the Umayyads near the end were quote unquote racist, as were other cultures." And yeah, it's an interesting. So you're saying the
Uh,
racism of
No, I don't
colonialism is
think it
different?
did. I mean, I think it depends what you mean, obviously, by racism. At the most, you could concede, most of the scholarship would say there's something like proto-racism. You have to understand what racism is. It's not
Interesting.
just having certain kind of prejudices,
Yeah.
because then that's or a certain judgment, but there's a kind of a racism which becomes linked to the fixity of that, of certain characteristics. There's a racism which becomes articulated through science, and it becomes a scientific category. Um, but I mean, there's a very interesting study which I've forgotten right now. Is that there's again, I would recommend the article in Reorient on the literature on Black excellence, which talks about the critique of two accounts of racism in Muslim circles. So there's a Curse of Ham, the critique of Curse of Ham, which was again, and also the critique of the environmental factors leading to racial differentiation. So I think, and this is in the early modern period. So I think one has to be very, very cautious to extrapolate every kind of iniquity and say this is racial or this is racialized, etc. I think one just to be, I wouldn't accept that.
Right. So, I mean, in a sense, there is a special kind of racism, I think, that can be. What you're saying is that should be designated racism, and the stuff before that
No, no,
is
no. I'm not saying there's a special kind of racism. I'm saying racism is racism. I'm not saying it's a special category of racism. I think if you want to make an argument that
yeah,
racism is something which is transhistorical,
yeah,
which
yeah,
is what's being made there,
yeah.
then you have to make the argument, not the
I see.
assumption.
Okay, okay. I look forward to looking at sort of the Black excellence discussion that you refer to in Reorient. Who's it by, incidentally?
Harun Bashir?
Okay, so it's the same one that you were referring to
Yeah,
earlier.
yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Sort of a colleague, in a sense, in my former institution, the Markfield Institute. The second question that's come in has come in from someone with a Bengali name. And I'm not going to try and read it and embarrass myself, to be honest, the name. I have a question for Dr. Salman Sayyid. If an anti-universalist argument is made to dismantle Western claims of universalism, doesn't Islam also claim it to be universal? So is Islam also not making universal claims? How do we deal with that?
Well, there are different kinds of universal claims. The universal claims made by European colonialism is not simply universal in the sense that everything is true. It's actually the application of particular forms of power to make those claims true. So one of the things I would say to you is this, that anti-universalism, as what I'm talking about, the context right now of universalism, is basically Eurocentrism, the idea that European culture, European thinking, European history is a model for the rest of the planet.
Right,
That's what is being universal right now.
right,
And it has its own peculiarities on that. So look at, for example, the commentary around what's happened in Afghanistan, right? Look at the various erasures that are taking place in this and the rewriting, that you would think that the occupation for 20 years was there to
yeah,
safeguard Afghan women's rights,
right,
where you would think that dropping bombs on women, and which killed mainly women and children, probably doesn't do much for their rights in a way. But look at the erasure of some of the kind of the talking about the occupation as somehow being demanded because of the focus on certain groups in Kabul, many of them who were benefited from the occupation, is that the experience of rural Afghanistan, for example. Or take something like this, that the pictures that we saw about a plane in the planes in Kabul and the mad rush for people to get there. But
yeah,
imagine a scenario that if you were to put a plane either in Dhaka, say that for the first 100,000 people will get ability to live in Canada or Australia or European Union or the United States, you might find there might be some crowd in Dhaka airport or in New Delhi airport or
mm,
even in Brasilia. So I think these are kind of reconfigurations of the way that's being presented, that the most important issue is, and people can see the kind of various anomalies around that. But the idea that what are the idea of these universal ways of presenting themselves, that everyone who is a human can only be a human in a way that is recognized by the Western gaze, or they're not human.
right.
That's what I think is what's at stake in this argument.
I mean, in your in recalling the Caliphate, you make this important distinction between the moral state and the ethical state, if I recall correctly, and saying that the Islamic State or the Caliphate, so to speak, should be an ethical state that is, in a sense, constantly assessing its own sort of.
No, what I
No.
try to argue is this. Well, I mean, I do make the distinction between morality and ethics. I think all
Mm,
societies have morality
mm,
because they have morals. In a sense, they have codes of conduct and behavior, etc.
right. Right.
But the ethical is really a disruption of that morality in
Mm,
relation to some higher purpose.
okay.
So, in a sense, the ethical is always going to be what the difference between the what is and what ought to be
Mm,
is what the ethical is trying to close at a different points in society. So, in a way, a state will always be imperfect
mm,
because it can never, because all it can aspire to is being moral. But
mm.
morality can always become ossified, can always become, and will always become ossified. So there has to be this ethical impulse to constantly renew that. And that's what I would say is the difference of the caliphate in a way, or the idea of the caliphate rather than the state of the caliphate, would
Mm.
always be something. The caliphate itself cannot be an ethical state. What is ethical is the Muslim impulse
Mm.
that to be a better, to close that gap between
So,
what is good and what is.
and you may have already sort of articulated this, but like what prevents the caliphate from becoming that kind of universalizing empire in the way that Eurocentrism or Europe or Euro America has become?
But I mean, for two things. One, that this way that European empires have articulate themselves. And I mean by European empires, read the European colonial ventures,
Right.
because if you want to use the kind of discredited historiography and talk about the Roman Empire's European empire, it's not.
Right.
So the
Right.
question isn't about the exercise of power.
Hmm.
It's the exercise of power inflected through racial logics.
Right. Right.
What prevents anything? So the question you're asking me is what prevents Muslims from doing harm? And I would say nothing prevents Muslims from doing harm except the exoneration of other Muslims for them to do good. And that kind of constant struggle that we have.
Right. Right. The
There's
ethical,
no
internal ethical
guarantee.
struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's a it's a communal struggle. It's an ethical struggle. It's a
Right.
constant
Right.
battle.
Right.
That's the only thing. But in the idea that a Muslim may do harm, so you cannot be then the justification for the Muslim should not be allowed to do anything,
Right.
because then
Right.
that's where the racial logics comes into it.
Right.
Why should a Muslim not be allowed to do something because they may do harm, but other humans can do harm?
Right. I mean,
You know,
I personally find very compelling the case that you make with which you started this conversation or this phase of the conversation, which is that, if you have any notion of the ethical or if you want Islam to matter in a sense, you do need to embrace the political as well.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what's the use of having something good if you're not going to share it?
Well, but I think the political doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be involved in spreading the word itself, but the political simply arises when there's disagreement. And unless you assume, which I do not, that Muslims are angels, or worse still, astaghfirullah, that they are divine. If they are not divine and they're not angels, then there is always going to be disagreement in that, because the disagreement, many times the disagreement would be disagreement of people working in good faith and coming to different conclusions and knowing, like you said, the phrase, only God knows. But that doesn't stop us. By saying only God knows doesn't mean that we do not need to strive to know better.
Right.
Because that would be, we strive to know better, but we admit that we will never complete that project of knowing.
Right.
But
right.
that doesn't mean that we should stop striving for knowing. That
Right.
seems to mean, so that's,
Right.
but if we are striving for knowing, we must also accept that there will be points where we come to disagreements.
Right.
And for me, the political is simply the recognition of disagreements and recognition that sometimes those disagreements can become very, very intense for very, very important reasons. So that's where I was to locate the political.
I'm tempted to ask about how the counter-hegemonic project fits in here, but I'm a bit conscious of your time, and we've just had 3 questions, including from your illustrious translator, Muhammad al-Bushra.
Oh.
So let me, I'll get to him in a moment, because we had someone, Goharwani first, who's asking, what is your assessment of Muslim scholars who prefer to side with the colonial baggage and discredit decolonial scholars? I don't know what to make of that.
I have no assessment of their scholarship, but I have a degree of skepticism about their, how can I say, political acumen.
Right,
I think anyone who assigns themselves with the colonial baggage, as the questioner put it, in the end is turning their back on the possibility of Muslims being able to write their own history, to be able to write their own future.
I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure who he's referring to, though. I wonder if you have any
But
thoughts.
I think there are many. No, there are scholars, for example, who've talked about sabr being a virtue, and therefore we should not rebel against in that sense there.
Right. Okay.
Now, I'm not saying that, far be it from me to encourage anyone to, take actions, because people have to make those judgments, and these are strategic judgments because of the situation they find themselves.
Yeah.
But I don't think the idea that if you see injustice and cruelty, surely you should try and do whatever is possible to do. Otherwise, what is happening to the Uyghurs now? Should we just turn around and say, well, I'm not a Uyghur, I'm not in China. Turn around.
Yeah.
No, I'm not saying, so what can we do? If nothing else, you can try and make sure that you bear witness to what's happening.
Right. Yeah, I didn't clock on to that sense of scholar. I was thinking academic for a moment, but it's quite obvious that this is what's being talked about. Muhammad Sayyid al-Bushra adds, regarding universalism, I think these might be more comments, so please feel free to add on to them at the end of it. But regarding universalism, I would argue that Islam makes universal claims while simultaneously acknowledging the impossibility of applying those universal claims to those who do not sign on to it. And in addition, he adds, very brief example, Islam's making space for legal pluralism versus Westernese eternal discomfort with legal pluralism.
I think Muhammad, as usual, has picked on makes a very valid point, and I agree with him entirely. I think that's exactly, if you look at one of the narcissistic fantasies of Europe is somehow that Muslim societies were homogeneous. And for example, and it gets around this by talking about the exceptionality of Cordoba or this thing. But if you look at other historians who've looked at what Cordoba is not exceptional. Muslim societies were mainly urban, and they were often in areas of major settlements. So Muslims were quite used to heterogeneity in a way that the Europeans at the time did not really experience. And these kind of pluralisms, even the category of el-Kitab itself allows for the fact that there are going to be different pathways and different ways of thinking about it. So I think that's a very good way of putting it.
If it's okay, I'm going to add the final comment. It's just come in from Gihad Hassanin. I'm going to do this because I'm giving preferential treatment to one of my new doctoral students. Some of the discomfort with decoloniality stems from its coming from non-Muslim struggles. So there is a fear that it'll be one other foreign element. And I don't know if you want to conclude with a reflection on that, or if you'd like to conclude with a broader sort of...
Gihad, you've turned so quickly from anti-essentialism to essentialism, and it didn't take it just took the offer of a place in Oxford.
Right.
No, listen, what I would say to her, and she knows this, is that let's recognize that the idea of what is the West is a function of historiography, not history. So that's the first thing. Idea of decolonial sources or decolonial struggles. I think there are many, many decolonized struggles of decoloniality that Muslims can embrace and should embrace. So I don't think they have an intrinsic identity as being Western or non-Western. I think it's the kind of historiography and how you claim and reclaim those. And I think one of the problems that the Muslims challenges is right now is to gain some kind of, I wouldn't say control, but some kind of ability to be able to narrate our history. And I think that's a really important part, because only through narrating our history you can write the future. So that's how I would answer that. Don't worry about where decoloniality comes from. Where does paper come from?
Yeah. No, she adds that wasn't her opinion. She's just giving advice on how to counter the argument. But yes, no, absolutely.
Sorry, I know her, and
yes, of course.
She was of course. So I'm maybe slightly I'm being mischievous with her in a way. But I would say that I would look. Take something like the coins, the first Muslim coins. Originally, Muslims started using coins, which were basically coins of the Romans or the Persians. Then they started remodifying those coins there. They don't have to make an argument that that coin or the technology of coins is Muslim for it to be Muslim use. It's how we use it. And if the coins then become users and markers of Muslimness, which they did become, then I don't see any problem with that, unless you have to go for this kind of idea that there is a pure, authentic, something which is pure, authentic Muslim, and if anything else which is not Muslim. And I don't think you could do it historically, and B, I think it'd be very, very. What would be the point of it all?
Yeah. No, I mean, in a sense, that sort of a xenophobic project was rejected very early on, I think.
But also, look, it's an old-time Sumerian kind of thing. You could say writing is Sumerian. The Quran is written in Sumerian. It's written in writing. It doesn't matter. It doesn't make it Sumerian because it's written and the writing is there. It's, I think these genealogical claims are, they may be useful or not, but they don't really tell us very much about anything in a way.
Hmm.
And certainly the point is that for us to reclaim that in a way. Otherwise you'd end up otherwise you would say Islam is only to be found in in that small bit of the Arabian Peninsula, because everything else is innovation, as everything else is nothing new.
Right.
Fruits are different. There are fruits that we know that don't grow and could not have been eaten by the Prophet and the companions, but Muslims eat them.
Right. Right. I'm conscious of your time, Professor. So I just want to say it's been a delightful hour and 15 minutes of conversation, reflection, and I look forward to future opportunities. I look forward to reading your forthcoming books. But I just wanted to thank you, and inshallah, we will have the opportunity to meet in person in the not too distant future.
Inshallah, we will do. And I just want to thank you for giving me this opportunity, and thanks all
It's
the
our honor.
wonderful questions that we put through there. And I look forward to further engagements and conversations. So
Inshallah.
it's just good to hear from so many friends and people that you meet in these kind
Yes.
of occasions.
I apologize to Imran Mullah because I couldn't take his final sort of question,
I've
but
got if this question is a brief one, I can take it. I've got a few minutes on that.
I
So
can read it to you, and you can
yeah,
judge whether he's saying pre-modern Islamic polities allowed for significant pluralism, but also usually imposed legal disabilities on non-Muslims. How do Muslims deal with this history in thinking about governance today?
I think you have to be very, very cautious about this history, because in a way that reading is a very kind of standard Eurocentric reading. So take something like, I would argue that until about at least the 100 years after the Atlantic revolutions in Haiti, in the Americas, in France, etc., if you were a person who was, let's say, marginal in society, if you could live anywhere on earth at that time in a settled state society, you'd want to live under Muslim rule. And I don't
Right,
say this under a romantic position. It's a position that,
right,
other historians, Richard Bulliet, Caro Canero mentioned this as well,
right.
simply because there was a certain independent legal facility
Hmm.
which allowed people to do that. And the marker of this is how that pluralism exists. So the idea that, there was this kind of imposition of legal homogeneity. Look, I'll finish with this one particular
Sure.
example, and I've used this before, so forgive anyone who's heard me speak this before.
Right.
What is now Iraq and what is now England, um, give or take 100 years, England became continuously Christian at the same time as Iraq became continuously Muslim, right?
Hmm.
So about, let's say, to split the difference, about 1,000 years. Let's just say that,
Sure.
okay, more or less.
Okay.
If you go to England, you will find that there's no pre-Christian communities left. The only non-Christian communities arrive subsequently with firstly the Jewish migration, and then in the 1960s with the post-colonial migration, the Muslims here, the Hindus, the Sikhs, the Jews. They're all, but none of the indigenous. There are no pagans. Leaving
Hmm.
aside heavy metal rock fans and things like that, there's no viable pre-Christian community.
Sure.
If you go to Iraq, despite the depredations of the ISIS, you will find that there are communities which predate
Hmm.
the existence of Islam,
Right.
which continue to function. So why is it that we understand this problem of pluralism and tolerance and saying it was imposed? So what happened to all the plural communities in England, that they're no longer viable, they just don't exist? Whereas you can find those plural communities easily in Iraq in a viable sense. When I mean viable, I mean hundreds of thousands rather than 5 or 6 people on their own. That, it seems to me, and I would say to you, that is not peculiar to Iraq. There are many things peculiar to Iraq. That is something that you'd find in many, many parts of the Muslimstan. It is something you'd hardly find in Europe. Where are the pre-Christians of Europe?
We
There are
know
many
where the yeah.
pre-Muslims. Yeah.
We
So
know where the
if
millions of Jews of Europe were from the last century
well,
are.
it's not. But
Yeah.
let's not even talk about. I'm not that I don't talk, but I'm saying
Sure.
even before then, If you
Right.
look at all of these other pre-Christian traditions,
Right, right.
where are they to be found except on the fringes of the heavy metal scene? They don't exist as viable communities. So,
Fascinating.
and that must
Fascinating.
tell us something. What does that? So, I think that example, and this is where I say to it, we lack examples by which to tell our own stories and to broaden the horizon of imagination of what actually happened. So you start off with this thing about, well, Muslims imposed this idea that either you take the sword or you take the Quran, and they drove out heterogeneity. But in all the places where heterogeneity can be found
Right.
was under Muslim rule.
Right.
Right. And I don't think, if you want to compare, final example, and I'll finish with this. Two examples, two good examples of the most integrated communities in Europe, I would say, were probably, German Jews and Bosnian Muslims, and nothing bad ever happened to them. So I think when you look at the history and look at the evidence, or which it purports to us, then I think Muslims should be a little cautious about simply accepting the narrative that Islam meant the liquidation. Muslim rule, despite in India, for example, Muslim rule in many parts of the world remains, that they remained viable. They've shrunk, they've become less entrenched. They certainly are not as powerful, but they still exist.
Right. Yeah, I mean, these are shibboleths in a sense that need to be deconstructed by,
or
I think,
decolonized.
And decolonized by the creation of new alternative stories and scholarship, but also I think narrative is very important. I like how you.
I think it's scholarship and disseminating that scholarship into the community. I would like our madrasas to be able to, and we send people send their children to this, and I would like them, apart from learning about the classical kind of, they should know these examples, because those are the examples that confront them on days like that, and let others say, well, actually, how do we explain that? After 1,000 years of Christian rule, there are no non-Christians left. After 1,000 years of Muslims, there's still non-Muslims.
Right. There's a lot of gratitude in the comments, and I mean, people are just expressing their admiration for the podcast, and I'm very grateful for your time. And
well, thank you very much for everyone. And I know we said our goodbyes there, but thank you, and I really appreciate this opportunity.
Inshallah, and I look forward in a week's time, for if anyone's interested, I'll be hosting Mary Elston, who's at Harvard. She's recently completed her PhD on the conceptions of tradition of the ulama in Egypt. So quite a different sort of topic, but I look forward to seeing plenty of viewers in that. And I want to conclude by really thanking Prof Salman Sayyid for giving us of his time and his insights, and making us seriously sort of think about some crucially important sort of issues for Muslims who want to decolonize their states of mind, shall we say.
Inshallah.
And with that, I'll give you my salam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.